I think one of the most impressive things that I've enjoyed about learning from Alan is his just absolutely winsome presence as an educator. So we're very, very fortunate to have him here today talking with us about Dorothy Sayers. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs.
Thanks, everybody. So we've got a several-week thing going here, and so I'm going to talk to you for 2 weeks about Sayers, and then my very distinguished colleague Philip Jenkins is going to come to talk about the Council of Nicaea, and then we're going to talk about Dorothy Sayers again. Now that seems like kind of an odd thing to do, but there's a reason for it, and that's that Dorothy Sayers actually wrote a play about the Council of Nicaea, which is a very strange thing to write a play about. But we want to talk about that, and we want to understand why she did that. And I think that play, it's got its ups and downs and its pluses and minuses as a play, but I think it is great in showing why the decisions that were made at the Council of Nicaea about who Jesus is are directly, immediately, permanently relevant to every single one of us. That it matters in so fundamental a sense. And how all that unfolded is what Philip Jenkins will be telling you about. And if you don't know Dr. Jenkins, he's one of the great living historians. He's an amazing person to have here. He's a Welshman, and I always tell my British friends, I tell them how many books he's published, I tell them about all this, and they go, yeah, but then I tell them that they know very well that there is this British quiz show called Mastermind. And Mastermind is like Jeopardy on steroids, right? You have to be incredibly learned. So it's like one of the great achievements of English civilization to even participate in Mastermind. And Philip actually won Mastermind in 1979. He is a Mastermind champion. He's got his own page on the BBC website, just for this achievement, which is like way better than becoming like, having an Order of the British Empire or something like that, So if you didn't know you could trust him, now you know that you can. But we're going to talk about Sayers first. And she is, I think, one of the most important Anglican intellectuals, more generally Christian intellectuals of the 20th century. But the route that she took to get there is a remarkable one. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is I want to take you up to the point of her beginnings as a public Christian. Because it's not really anybody else's way. And I think it's a really encouraging story about the way that God can use people even when they don't know that they're willing to be used. So I'll tell you a bit about her. So you see she's well, you may or may not be able to see because I made the font too small, but she was born in 1893, and she was born in Oxford. And this is Christ Church College, Oxford. It's not one of the oldest of the Oxford colleges, but it's one of the richest. It was founded by Henry VIII's Chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, and fabulously rich. And if you look on the right side of that picture, you'll see the college chapel. And it maybe gives you a sense of how rich Christ Church is, that's the college chapel from the from the inside. So it is unique in England in that it is a college chapel that is also a cathedral. The Bishop of Oxford is that's his seat is Christ Church. It's called the Christ Church College Chapel. when you're thinking about the students who have to get up at 8 a.m. and come. And then it is known as Christ Church Cathedral when you're thinking of it as the cathedral church of the diocese. So it's the one of the great Oxford College chapels that you can always come to see without buying a ticket or anything like that. There's just kind of a side door that you go into, and you can go to a worship service there. Dorothy Sayers' father, George, was an ordained minister. He was a priest in the Church of England, though he probably would have said parson. And he was a teacher as well. And they had a choir school, a school for choristers, little boys who sort of got their scholarships by their ability to sing, at least up until their voices changed. And George Sayer taught them Latin, among other things. Sayers later in life referred to them as little demons with angel voices. So she was born in Oxford. She had a kind of a reverence for Oxford all of her life and was very proud of being from there. But her father got an opportunity to be the rector of a church in the countryside. This is it. It is St. Mary's Church in Bluntisham, in Hertfordshire. Well, no, it's not. It's Huntingdonshire, yeah. And it's been in different counties at different times as they've organized these things. Now, some of you, in reading 19th century fiction, I bet some of you are Jane Austen fans or Anthony Trollope fans, or you will notice that they use, for the priest of a parish, they'll typically use the word vicar, whereas Aaron is not a vicar, he's a rector. And what does that mean? In the Church of England, it's a little different in here. In the Church of England, you're a vicar if you are the chief priest at a parish that is dependent on the diocese for its financial support. Okay? But some churches are financially self-sustaining. Maybe they have endowments, like rich former parishioners have, paid, put money in permanently to keep it running. If it's a self-supporting parish, financially self-supporting parish, then the priest in charge is called a rector. So, in general, in the Church of England back in the day, to get a job as a rector is a more attractive thing than to get a job as a vicar because it's more financially secure, less likely to have the ups and downs. You pretty much know what your situation is going to be. And George Sayer, perhaps having had enough of little demons with angel voices, decided that he was going to take this job. So they move into the deep East Anglian countryside, the Fen country, low-lying, marshy area. They did not even have running water in the rectory. The household servants had to go and pump the water out of the well and bring it up in the morning. And it's just interesting to think about the kind of change that happened in the 20th century is that Dorothy Sayers grew up in a house that did not have running water, and by the time she died, Sputnik had gone into orbit. There's never been a period in human history where the changes have been that fast and that dramatic. So that's basically where she grew up. And then at a time when women could not receive university degrees from Oxford or Cambridge, they could from a couple of other places. One of the first places in the British Isles to offer university degrees to women was Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and one of the first women to get a degree there, it happened to be a degree in mathematics, was C.S. Lewis's mother. But no degrees at Oxford and Cambridge for women. There were colleges at Oxford and Cambridge for women, but they could not get degrees from the university yet, right? They often had, this actually became a source of embarrassment because there were, they would give university examinations, and then they would, and the women, even though they couldn't get university degrees, would take the same entrance examinations. And so there was a prize given to the person who had the highest university entrance examination score. And when women won those prizes for like 9 years in a row, it began to get a little awkward. So then they stopped revealing the names of the people who had won. You know? It was either that or let the women graduate. What were you going to do? So, but it was obvious to George Sayer and to his wife that Dorothy was very intellectually gifted and that she really needed to go to university, even if it wasn't clear that was going to result in a degree. So the place that she went was Somerville College. Somerville was the first great women's college at Oxford. There were two kind of dominant ones at Cambridge, Newnham and Girton, but at Oxford, for a while, Somerville was the big one. And it has an amazing network of alumni. Margaret Thatcher was a graduate of Somerville. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, was a graduate of Somerville College. It was a really remarkable place, and Sayers loved it. She just, every moment of it was wonderful to her. The problem is that when she graduated, getting her degree from Somerville, but not yet a degree from Oxford, her degree was a first, and a first-class degree in undergraduate at Oxford or Cambridge was actually by itself qualification for an academic position. Like, you did not get a first-class degree unless your professors thought you were already prepared to join them. So there was no greater medievalist in the 20th century than J.R.R. Tolkien, probably the most influential medievalist of the 20th century. Even if he had never written fiction, his degree was a BA. That was it. Got his BA, became a scholar. So that door was open to Sayers because she had her BA in French, primarily medieval French, and she could have become a medievalist. But she thought she was too social to be an academic, which is kind of funny because she ends up being a writer, which is like much less social than being an academic. So she said, I don't think I want to do that. She tried teaching, she tried various things. She worked in publishing, and she wrote poetry. This was Sayers during her undergraduate days. And she wrote 2 books of poems that were published by Basil Blackwell. Blackwell's is the famous bookshop in Oxford. But then they started doing a publishing house. And she was one of the first to be published there. And if you'll notice that the first one is just called Opus 1. Those are poems mainly about Oxford. And then the second one is called, actually the full title is Catholic Tales and Christian Songs. And what had happened to Sayers while she had been at Oxford is that she had become what people have different names for it. Sometimes people talk about the Oxford movement. Sometimes they talk about the Tractarian movement. Sometimes they talk about Anglo-Catholicism. Very high church, very Catholic looking and sounding. She called herself an English Catholic. And her great influence as an English Catholic was G.K. Chesterton. And I just got pictures of Chesterton because, first of all, look at the hair. Man, I am profoundly envious of that hair. Chesterton was 6'4". He weighed well over 300 pounds. Once when during World War I, he was walking down the streets of London and a woman came up to him and said, "Why aren't you out at the front?" Meaning the front of the war. And he said, "Out at the front. Madam, if you come around this way, you'll see that I am." So Chesterton was kind of the model of the English Catholic for her. Now, later on, he became Roman Catholic, but that did not happen until 1922. And I think one of the things that Sayers realized about herself was that as a poet, she was not going to be very original. Her poems are so much like Chesterton's, and it was sort of, well, why just be an echo of something? But if she's not going to do that, and she's not going to be an academic, and she doesn't want to work in publishing anymore, what is she going to do? And finding a job was a real problem for her. And then something came into her life. Benson's Publicity Limited. Benson's Publicity was the first really big London advertising firm. And when she showed a facility for writing advertising copy, she actually got assigned to some of their biggest clients. And the one that she's maybe today most famous for is that she was the person who wrote all the ads for Guinness. Guinness Stout. If he can say as you can, Guinness is good for you. How grand to be a toucan. Just think what toucan do. And so that was, her two catchphrases were Guinness is good for you and Guinness, it gives you strength. And these were phenomenally successful. But her triumph at the time was a campaign that she ran for Coleman's mustard. Are some of you familiar with Coleman's mustard? You still get it in the little yellow tin, right? Powdered mustard. And she created something called the Mustard Club. And there were signs all over London and in other parts of England as well, like on the buses, saying, "Has Papa joined the Mustard Club?" And nobody knew what the heck a mustard club was, but they were like, "Oh, I'm clearly missing out. I clearly need to join the Mustard Club." And so they made a little film of about the Mustard Club. I mean, it was this multimedia campaign, one of the very first. And so she was quite successful. She was much loved at Benson's. She did very well at Benson's. They didn't pay her very much because she was a woman, but she liked it. Wasn't altogether satisfying, though. And so what to do with herself in her life continued to be an issue. She had a propensity for falling in love with men that she shouldn't have fallen in love with. And so there was one guy in particular that she had this really intense relationship with. His attitude was basically, well, I might marry you, but I don't know whether you really love me, so you should have sex with me to prove that you love me, and then maybe I'll marry you. And she said to him that she didn't like the idea of thinking of marriage as a bad conduct prize. And so eventually he left her. He was an American, Americans, and went back to America. And sort of on the rebound, she ended up having a purely sexual affair with a man that she didn't love at all, and she got pregnant. And it took her a long time to figure out what to do. She had a weird kind of advantage in that she became later in life a famously large woman, and she had already started to become larger, and she had started wearing very loose, flowing garments. And so she was able to conceal from the people at Benson's her pregnancy while she thought about what to do. And she ended up thinking about this, that she had a cousin whom she was close to when she was growing up, was older than her, who made her living by fostering children. And she got in touch with her cousin Ivy and said, hey, I happen to know of a baby that's coming soon. Do you have room for one more? And Ivy said yes. And it was actually only after the child was born that Sayers said, it's actually my baby. And so her son, John Anthony, was raised. There was never any thought of marrying the father. And in any case, turned out he was married. She found that out relatively late. Turned out not to be the worst thing, because he went back to his wife and said, I got this girl pregnant. I feel bad about it. Can you help her out? And his wife, who was apparently an incredibly kind person, said sure. And arranged for this guy's wife, her brother was an obstetrician. And she arranged for her brother to deliver Sayers' baby, for her to have a kind of a maternity home where she could stay for a while she was recovering. She was incredibly generous. She even went and moved into Sayers' apartment in London and would answer mail for her so that nobody would know where she was. This woman was an absolute saint. And as a result, the baby, John Anthony, ends up being left with Ivy, and nobody at Benson's ever found out, and she came back to work after she told them that she was sick and took a sick leave, and when she came back, everything was fine. Nobody ever found out. How she pulled it off is just unimaginable, but she did. And meanwhile, as if she didn't have enough to do, as if she didn't have enough on her plate, she had decided that she wanted to try writing detective stories. Now, that was not unusual, because as far as I can tell, in the 1920s, every single person in England was writing detective stories. It was before the 1920s, it was basically Sherlock Holmes. And then there was a kind of a knockoff of Sherlock Holmes for kids called Sexton Blake. There were like hundreds and hundreds of Sexton Blake stories written by many different people. And then, as sort of like a sideline, you had Chesterton's Father Brown stories. But that was kind of it. There wasn't a whole lot else. And then in the 20s, it just absolutely exploded, where like nobody was reading anything else, nobody was writing anything else. There were all these poets and academics who were like, well, I'm going to try that. I'm going to make a few bucks on the side, you know. It was just, everybody was doing it. All of a sudden. No one totally understands why, but I think it had a lot to do with World War I, which was recently concluded. And the misery and the carnage of that war was so horrific, the bloodiest war in human history by miles and miles, that I think people couldn't forget death. Too many people had died, which, by the way, is one of the things created problems for women of Sayers' age, because there were all of a sudden far less marriageable men than there were marriageable women. So many young men died in the war that you had this imbalance. And I think a murder mystery acknowledges death, but it says we can deal with it. You know, we can deal with it, and then things can go back to normal. I think a murder mystery is kind of consoling in that sense. Bad things happen, but we can put the society back together again. And the perpetrators can be isolated and punished. So I think a murder mystery is a way of managing the terrors of death. That's my theory. I don't know that that's right, but if I didn't think it was right, I wouldn't call it my theory. Chesterton used to say that he hated it when people committed the abominable heresy of saying, I might be wrong. He says, of course you're not wrong. If you thought you were wrong, you wouldn't be saying this. Just say you believe it. So that's what she was doing on the side. And it is, people often think of Sayers as sort of coming along a little behind Agatha Christie. She was actually getting started at almost exactly the same time as Agatha Christie. It just took her a little longer to find a publisher, right? So she starts writing these are just sort of random early covers. I just thought they were fun. I love the skull on the upper left-hand side, the Murder Mystery Monthly. So she starts writing these detective stories. But her favorite novelists, though she enjoyed the Sherlock Holmes stories, she enjoyed, when she was young, she enjoyed the Sexton Blake stories. She said she even when she was older, she liked reading those when she was sick, because they weren't very intellectually demanding and they were just adventures, you know. But her favorite writers were the great Victorian novelists, who managed to make novels that were very entertaining, very dynamic, full of exciting plots, and yet were also social commentaries as well. They said a lot about the societies they were in, and she wanted to write that sort of thing. So her books started getting more and more complicated. Now, you see that happening, I think, maybe best in this book, The Nine Tailors, which is a book that she wrote soon after the death of her father. And I think that this is set in a little small town in the Fens, a little village in the Fens, a great big magnificent church, which some of those little Fen villages have because it was a wealthy place, despite its low-lying, marshy environment. And one of the main characters is the rector of this parish. And I think one of the things that she's doing in that story is just showing people what the rector of a parish does, how many things the rector of a parish does. And of course, it's worth remembering, for those of us in this room, that the rector of a parish has more and more to do as a parish becomes more successful, right? And one of the things that happens is that people say, oh, let's see if we can poach one of the associate priests from this church, because these are clearly people who know what it's like to be in a thriving church. Let's steal Kara away. Let's steal Andrew away. I'm not saying that that's unethical. I'm not saying that it's unethical, but so the more that Aaron is able to bring people to St. Albans to hear of the boundless grace of Jesus Christ offered for us, for broken people like us, miserable offenders like us, then the more problems he creates for himself, you know. And there's something going on all the time, you know. Once my son started working here at St. Albans, I was like, how does a church stay alive? How does this happen? And Sayers is in some ways doing that. One of the things that she does is, in compensation, is that she gives her father this big, magnificent church. And she got a friend of hers, or an acquaintance of hers, an architect, to draw a picture of Finn Church, St. Paul. And her father loved change ringing. That is, you ring the bells of the church in certain sequences. It's not a melody, it's a sequence, ever changing, right? So you might have, if the bells, you have 9 of them, it might be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, 4, 6, 8, 1, 3, and the constant permutations, that's called change ringing. And so her father loved that. And so she's paying tribute to him in that way as well. But it's a very ambitious book, because it's a book also about sin. It's a book about where darkness comes from. It's a book about what holds a community together and what breaks a community apart. It's just really wonderful novel, and there are a lot of especially Anglican mystery writers who do this kind of thing. Now, that's Agatha Christie, and Agatha Christie, though the best-selling writer in history, and though she stays within the pattern a little better or a little more closely than Sayers, she's not quite as ambitious in terms of reaching out. There's still a kind of an ongoing social commentary there. And so Sayers' detective is Lord Peter Wimsey, and the best known detective, and the one that Agatha Christie used the most often, was Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective, with his littergreisers. But the second, and to me the more interesting one, is Miss Marple, Jane Marple, the elderly spinster from the village of St. Mary Mead. And this was her first novel in which she appeared, was The Murder at the Vicarage. And one of Miss Marple is introduced by actually a police inspector who says, well, yeah, when I get stuck, I ask Miss Marple to take a look at things. And everybody is like, why? Why do you call in some little old lady from a village? And Miss Marple is often, when she is praised, she says, really, I have no gifts at all, except perhaps a certain knowledge of human nature. And where does she get that knowledge of human nature? Well, two places. One, she says, you live in a little village, you actually get to see everybody up close. You know, your neighbors are not strangers to you. And you see their peculiarities, and you see their oddities, and you see what's good about them and what's not so good about them. But I also think there's something else. Every Sunday at the parish church of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple would have said, along with everyone else in the congregation, the general confession from the Book of Common Prayer, which begins this way: Almighty and most merciful Father, we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. We have followed this, I love this phrase, we have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. And I love that word devices, right? It means things you devise, right? It means your little schemes, you know, the little plans you have to get your way. The devices and desires of our own hearts. We have offended against thy holy laws. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done, and there is no health in us. Now, that's a cliffhanger. To see where it goes from there, you have to look at your prayer book, okay? Let me just say, it doesn't leave us in exactly that position, but that's where it starts. Knowledge of human nature, right? Probably the successor of Sayers and Agatha Christie, who has done the most to extend detective fiction into the world of serious social and psychological commentary, is P.D. James, who just died about a decade ago. An extraordinary novelist. I think one of the greatest novelists of her time in any genre, right? And there's the title of one of her best books, Devices and Desires, right? Because that's really where she's drawing her understanding of human nature from as well. So if you wonder why are so many of the most interesting, the most sophisticated, the most ambitious of mystery writers, why are so many of them Anglicans? I think, well, listen to the General Confession, and think about where that can take your mind, and how it helps you to think about other people. It's, I really do think that has something to do with it. How are we doing? Are we doing okay so far? Is this making sense? I'm just covering a lot of territory today, and we'll be able to do some more back and forth stuff this time. But if there's anything that is fundamentally confusing or upsetting or agitating, then by all means, ask me now, okay? We can deal with that. Anybody got anything? It would be okay. Okay. You're just riveted by this story. That's the spin I'm putting on it. Sure. And then, so let's sum up where Sayers is at this point. I told you that when she was at Oxford, she discovered this high church, Anglo-Catholic, English Catholic is what she would have called it. She discovered this way of worship, and it became very important to her. One of the effects it had was to alienate her slightly from her parents, because they were not Anglo-Catholic. They were just kind of standard issue. C.S. Lewis said about himself, I'm just an ordinary layman of the Church of England, neither especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. And that's kind of where George Sayers was. He was just kind of down the middle. He was an English parson who loved the traditions of the church and loved the Book of Common Prayer. But he was certainly not Anglo-Catholic. He would not have had incense in his services. He would have called the service that's done from here, he would have called it Holy Communion. He would not have called it Mass. But the Anglo-Catholics would have called it Mass, right? So that distanced her a little bit from them. And there was already, she loved her parents. She always loved them very much. But there was always a bit of a distance, because when she was at school, she went to a girls' school in Salisbury, her parents pressured her to be confirmed. And she did, but she always resented it. It was interesting how the confirmation is something, some of you have been through confirmation, some of you have had kids go through confirmation. It can be a very beautiful thing. It can also be a difficult thing, right? Because this is when kids are to own the faith in which they have been raised and to own it publicly. But man, 13, 14, that's a tough time to ask kids to do that, right? I mean, and for some of them, it's an easy call, but for others, it's just fraught, And Sayers was one of the ones for whom it was fraught. C.S. Lewis said that he thought that the darkest deed he had ever done in his life was to agree to be confirmed. Because at the time, he said, I had no belief whatsoever. He said, I lied my way through the entire service. And he felt grief-stricken about that later on, that he never should have done that. But he just couldn't face telling his father, I don't believe this, right? So it puts kids in a tough place. And Sayers, I think, was someone who really, that bothered her that her parents pushed her in that direction. And then when she was at Oxford, she finds this English Catholicism as a kind of an alternative, and she embraced that for a while. People who knew her at Oxford and right after Oxford said that she was conspicuously Catholic. And you know how she was conspicuously Catholic? You know what made her a weirdo? when people said grace, she crossed herself. Among ordinary Church of England people, that's like, you might as well being like, wear a mitre, you know? Be there with a censer, you know? I mean, it was really extreme Catholicism to cross yourself when grace was said. But from that point on, we know nothing about her religious life. Now, this is a problem for me because I'm writing a biography of Dorothy Sayers right now, and I spent a lot of time at Wheaton College in Illinois, where they have the largest collection of Sayers. They have books, letters. I mean, it's just amazing. 36,000 items. I can't find anything that suggests that from roughly 1921 till the late 1930s that she ever went to church. There's no evidence that she went to church. Maybe she did, but it would be odd that nothing would indicate it. So the issue comes up at a very difficult moment. And that's when her cousin Ivy writes and says, you know, your son John Anthony, he's not been baptized. And when it's time to send him to school, people are going to want his baptismal records. So should I have him baptized? And Sayers was like really freaked out by this question. And she started writing about how, you know, my parents pushed me into confirmation, but I guess baptism isn't really like that. And she is the local parishioner, is he an evangelical? Because if he's an evangelical, I'd really rather not, you know. But if he's a good Catholic, then, but I don't know. In the end, she says, like, hey, you make the call. She's kind of acknowledging, I'm actually not raising this child, which is, I think, a painful thing for her to have had to say. So there's no evidence that she was a churchgoer. There was no evidence that she had any Christian belief. Her sleuth, Lord Peter Wimsey, is not a believer. He's very open about not being a believer. But he was raised in the church, and he knows all the responses in the prayer book, and he can quote lots of scripture. And so you have this setting in the Nine Tailors, which is all about this church, but the main character of the story is someone who doesn't believe in it. Though he does think about it, but he doesn't believe in it. Okay. That's the context. Does that make sense? So, this is Canterbury Cathedral. That's actually the east end of Canterbury Cathedral, which is built in around in the 1160s. Nice place. Canterbury, the cathedral had just started around the time that Sayers was writing The Nine Tailors, had just started a festival to celebrate the cathedral. And they had looked for a kind of a public Christian to write a play for the festival, and the person they chose was T.S. Eliot. And he wrote a play for them called Murder in the Cathedral, about the murder of Thomas à Becket, who was Archbishop of Canterbury at the time and then became Saint Thomas à Becket. And that went very well. That was splendid. And so the next person they invited was another prominent Anglican writer, Charles Williams, later soon, actually, to be a very close friend of C.S. Lewis's, already a close friend of Eliot's. He wrote a play called Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury. It's terrible. I'm just saying, don't even try. Read Murder in the Cathedral by Eliot, but as for Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury, don't even try. And they asked Williams, who do you think we should ask next? And he said, oh, you should ask Dorothy Sayers. Now, why did he say that? Well, he actually remembered her early poems, the Catholic tales and Christian songs. And then he had read the 9 Tailors and he loved it. And he assumed, because of what he knew about her earlier life, that the 9 Tailors was also written from a perspective of faith. He assumed that she had continued to be a committed Christian. And maybe she had, but I don't see any evidence of it, and all of her written statements are very evasive and ambiguous and not at all indicative of faith. But Sayers said, you should ask her, she'll do a great job. Also, she wasn't a playwright. She was a novelist. But here's the thing, she was actually writing a play at the time. Williams didn't know that. He didn't know that she was writing a play. He did not know that she was continuing to be a faithful Christian. He did not know that she would have interest in any of this stuff. And yet he said, you should ask her. She will be great. It's the most out of the blue thing that ever happened to her. Most completely out of the blue. Where did this come from? Why is this happening? That ever happened to her. A representative of Canterbury Cathedral says, would you write a play for our festival? And she said, yes, I will. And so she wrote a play, which is called The Zeal of Thy House, which is about the building of Canterbury Cathedral. And the main character in the play is William of Seine, the French architect who designed that magnificent nave and oversaw the building of it that I was just showing you a moment ago. And it's a beautiful play. And it is a play which had the secondary effect. The primary effect was that it made for a very successful play at the festival. Everybody liked it. The play was actually so successful that it went on to the West End of London, which is basically the English equivalent of Broadway, right? It became a very successful play on the stage. It was terrific. Everybody loved it. But it had the effect of making Dorothy Sayers something that she had not been at any point since really at any point. It made her a public Christian. That she was not only known as a Christian, but she became a person that the English public turned to in order to have a better understanding of Christianity. And when all of those opportunities started coming her way, she grabbed them with both hands. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. Okay? So thanks for coming and paying attention, and I hope you'll come back.